Hi everybody, and welcome to Aerial Maps. In class, for some of my older students, we've been learning about just maps and how maps, how they show up in everyday work of artists. And so what we started to do kind of planning sketches to look at this concept of an aerial map. Our main goal was to emphasize patterns of geometric or straight edge, symmetrical kinds of lines and shapes, and organic lines and shapes, and also integrate the use of texture. So I had students create 2 different maps. And maps, again, we really talked about this idea of what's the difference between an aerial view and a side view. Developmentally, for kids like 4th, 5th grade, this can be a little bit of a harder concept. So this developmentally is right on track, to see if they can understand the difference between those. After that, we started to look at, with watercolor, how to practice lines, shapes, textures, and values using watercolor. And then after that, we started to transition to our actual maps. So I gave each student a thick piece of watercolor paper, and we started to, again, learn the basics of watercolor, learn the basics of what is a flat head, what is a round head. This is a perfect example. So it's round on the very top here. And again, this whole idea of watercolor the whole goal is that it's transparent, and that for kids sometimes can be a little bit of a stretch. So we always talk about painting the largest areas first. So as they're working and don't have 2 wet areas right next to each other. We also talk about this idea of blending other colors, this wet into wet. So if I were to paint 2 separate areas right next to one another, just double check that one of them is actually wet. Okay, and kids, it's great once you start to see them kind of clip along and get the basics. Okay, and the whole idea of these round heads are to get into small little spaces, whereas the flat heads, and these are thin synthetic bristles. So synthetic bristles tend to be, they're plastic. And so here, if I were to go over this section for wide, flat spaces, so we talk a lot about using the right brush for the right job. Okay, so here we are with aerial maps. We looked at the work of Paula Scheer, Virginia Moore, and Ai Weiwei, and how they integrate the use of maps in their work. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.